Good evening, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tim Huxley, Executive Director of IISS Asia, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, international branch based here in Singapore. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this latest event in the Fullerton Lecture Series in the ballroom of the historic Fullerton Hotel in the heart of Singapore's financial district. I'm very pleased to see such a large audience here on this cool Friday evening in Singapore. I think we have about 200 guests from Singapore's diverse communities, business, universities, think tanks, embassies, and government. We organize 6 lectures in this Fullerton series every year. Over the last 2.5 years since the Fullerton Lecture Series began, the speakers have included the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, then President Calderon of Mexico, the former Prime Minister of Thailand, Mr. Abhisit, and cabinet ministers from Canada, Germany, India, Japan, Philippines, Singapore, and even from Australia. Bob Carr was here a while ago. I'm delighted that this evening's IISS Fullerton Lecture takes the form of a conversation with Julia Gillard, who served as Australia's 27th Prime Minister for 3 years from 2010 until June last year. It's a privilege for us to benefit from your company this evening, and I and the IISS are very grateful to you for making the time to join us for this discussion. A few words of introduction. Julia Gillard was born in Barry, South Wales. That's Old South Wales, not New South Wales. And as a child, she emigrated with her family to Australia in 1966. She graduated from the University of Melbourne with a BA and a Bachelor of Laws in 1986. Before entering politics, she was a lawyer specializing in industrial law. She was first elected to Parliament for the Australian Labor Party in the 1998 general election. Following the 2001 election, she entered the shadow cabinet with the population and immigration portfolio. Two years later, Ms. Gillard took on the reconciliation and indigenous affairs and also health portfolios. In December 2006, when Kevin Rudd became ALP leader and leader of the opposition, she was elected as his deputy. When Labour won the 2007 general election, Julia Gillard became Australia's first female deputy prime minister. She simultaneously served as Minister for Education, Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations, and Minister for Social Inclusion. In June 2010, after Kevin Rudd resigned as party leader, and therefore as Prime Minister, Ms. Gillard was elected unopposed to replace him. The subsequent 2010 general election produced the first hung parliament in Australia in 70 years, and Julia Gillard formed a minority government with support from Green and independent MPs. As Prime Minister, and indeed as Deputy Prime Minister, Ms. Gillard was central to successfully managing Australia's economy, the world's 12th largest, during the global financial crisis, and as Australia positioned itself to seize the benefits of Asia's rise. Ms. Gillard developed the guiding policy paper, the White Paper, Australia in the Asian Century. As Prime Minister, she was also heavily involved in reforming Australian education, creating an emissions trading scheme, improving healthcare, aged care and dental care, and starting the nation's first ever national scheme to care for people with disabilities, restructuring the telecommunications centre and building a national broadband network. In foreign policy, Ms. Gillard strengthened Australia's alliance with the US, built stronger relations with China, upgraded ties with India, deepened ties with other Asian countries. She represented Australia at the G20, the East Asia Summit, chaired the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and also represented Australia at APEC. Australia was elected to the UN Security Council, and in October 2012, Ms. Gillard received worldwide attention for her speech in Parliament on the treatment of women in professional and public life. In June 2013, Julia Gillard was defeated by a leadership challenge from within her own party and announced that she would not contest a seat again at the next federal election, thereby effectively resigning from politics. Well, I'd like to organize this evening's conversation in the following way, if it's okay with you. Maybe I could start by asking you some questions about Australia's foreign policy, because the IISS is essentially concerned with foreign and security policy seen from an international perspective and in its broadest sense, and particularly about your government's role between 2010 and 2013 in shaping Australia's foreign policy. And I'd also like to ask you about your own leadership and the challenges that you faced as Prime Minister. And I think that will take about half of the hour that we have, and then after that there'll be a chance for members of our audience to pose their own questions, and then I might close with one or two more questions of my own. To initiate this conversation, I'd like to ask you first about Australia and Asia. I think it's striking that Australia is a highly successful country in many ways, but also a country which in some ways has always been isolated in its regional environment, because, to put it bluntly, it's culturally separated from Asia. It's on the edge of Asia, but historically it's not been part of Asia. And in I suppose what's now the fairly distant past, Australia relied on its economic and its political and security relations with the mother country, Britain. That relationship changed drastically after the reverses that Britain suffered, well, particularly in Singapore at the end of 1941, early 42. And I think, as one of my Australian academic friends put it, from Australia's viewpoint, after 1942, Britain was a busted flush in security terms. And then there was Britain's military withdrawal from Asia in the early 70s. And that forced Australia increasingly to look to the US for its security. And then Britain joined the European Economic Community, as it then was, in the mid-70s. And that meant that Australia needed to develop new economic relationships, particularly in Asia. The rise of China has come subsequently, and the relative decline in US power. And these mean that Australia has needed to become ever more closely engaged in Asia in a multifaceted way. So I suppose it's a no-brainer that Australia's future is in Asia, but clearly there are some challenges as well as opportunities for Australia. So given that context, I wonder if you could talk about the origins and the strategic purpose of that very important Australia in the Asian Century white paper, which your government released in late 2012.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and it's great to be joined by so many people in the audience, and I'll look forward to questions from the audience a little later. The sort of frame in which I put the Australia in the Asian Century white paper is I wanted a vehicle to explain to the Australian community how deep the ramifications were of Asia's rise. And people knew it in the sense that our economy was being subject to a huge resources boom, and that resources boom was literally going into building Asia, most particularly building China. Our iron ore was going to construction there, our coal was going to power there. And so this, was shaping our economy in good ways for some parts of the country, in more difficult ways for other parts of the country, because a very strong resources boom meant a very high and sustained Australian dollar, which put pressure on other areas. So people could feel and experience that. People knew, of course, about what was happening here in Singapore, our long-standing trade arrangements and friendship with Japan. People understood those things. Many Australians travel widely in Asia, so they had personal experience. but I didn't think that the whole picture had been painted, and I didn't think that we as a nation had really thought through what does it mean for everyone in different occupations that political weight, strategic weight, economic weight is increasingly in our region of the world. What does it mean for the school teacher? What does it mean for the journalist? As well as what does it mean for the top level public servant in our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade? And so the Australia in the Asian Century White Paper was really an endeavour to paint that picture. That this is, in the modern age, everybody's business. It's going to have ramifications for the school curriculum. When I was in school all those years ago, the smart kids got taught French and German because they were apparently the languages the smart kids were going to need. Well, clearly, in our schools today, we want students studying the languages of the region where they will work and they will trade. So it's got school curriculum ramifications, business ramifications. I would frequently say to journalists, why is it that I can put on the TV news and get all of the economic news coming out of Europe, but find it harder to get real-time news on mainstream TV, economic news out of Asia? You know, who's telling me what's happening in Indonesia today, for example? So it was to paint that comprehensive picture. It stood alongside two other pivotal policy pieces, a new defence white paper and a new national security strategy. So there was an aim across the board to modernise and refresh our outlook. One of the things that I was really pleased about in terms of the reception of the Australia in the Asian Century White Paper is it was well received in our domestic media, and that was good because there were days in government when good news was hard to find. But I was more impressed in some ways about how many leaders in the region read and absorbed the white paper, and it made them think again about Australia and Australia's sophistication around these issues. I thought that that was a real highlight of the impact that the white paper had.
I think a lot of people have said that that white paper was inspirational. Some critics have asked what the substantial policy outputs of the paper were, and how much of a real difference it has made to Australia's relations with Asia and with Asian countries in very functional terms.
Well, it heralded the development of a number of country strategies, so being clearer. I mean, it wasn't that we weren't in the diplomacy business before the Australia in the Asian Century White Paper. Obviously we were, but it was to make that diplomacy and its strategic settings clearer. I think it did help with that. I think it helped with bringing together across the public service an understanding of what we would need to do as a government to deal with Asia's rise and the changing geopolitical fortunes here. So the very fact, you know, one of the great challenges in government is you've got the sort of departmental stovepipes, but to get consensus and collaboration across around a set of ideas is quite difficult, and I think the white paper helped us do that. And so there were some deliverables around study of Asian languages and those sorts of things. But you know, it wasn't ever conceived as, you know, here are, $10, $100 million policies we are now going to do. We were doing a lot of things. The business community was doing a lot of things. Our universities were doing a lot of things, but they weren't being brought together in a coherent whole with people thinking and pointing out the synergies and the joining points, and that's what I wanted the white paper to do.
Another point that some commentators made was that the Australia in the Asia Century White Paper gave a lot of emphasis to the opportunities of the Asian century, but didn't really highlight some of the risks and dangers and potentially adverse challenges that could arise. And it seems to me, in a way, that's an unfair criticism because your government also issued a defence white paper and a national security strategy, which did talk about those potentially adverse developments in Asia. But I wonder if we could move to focus a little bit on the potential dangers in Asia, or maybe more broadly defined the risks in the region, and particularly I'd like to ask you how you see potential dangers that might accompany China's rise in particular. I think this is one of the biggest ever foreign policy challenges for Australia in the long term. Clearly, Australia has this hugely valuable economic relationship with the People's Republic, which you alluded to earlier, in the sense of Australian natural resources being used to build China, as you put it. But at the same time, it seems that there are real reasons to be concerned about China's international behavior, its behavior in the region, particularly the way that China relates to smaller powers in the Asia-Pacific. And in the circumstances, it seems natural for Australia in security terms to pull closer to the United States in reaction to China's rise. And Australia, of course, is not alone in doing that in recent years. Many countries in the Asia-Pacific are grappling with this dilemma. So I suppose the question is, how do you think Australia should manage its relations with China? Do you think it's possible to remain close to both China and to the United States in the longer term? Or do you think Australia will need to make a choice?
That is a very good question, and if you wanted to boil down contending schools of thought in Australian public policy, you've basically done it in the question. There would be one school of thought that would say it is not possible for us to have good and growing relationships with both the US and China, and we will have to choose one school of thought. I am unambiguously in the other school of thought, which is that this is not a zero-sum game. It's a complex game. It's not a simple game, but it's not a zero-sum game. And it is possible to strengthen our alliance with the United States whilst at the same time strengthening our relationship with China. And coming from me, they aren't just words. I set about proving this, and during the 3 years of my Prime Ministership, we took another step forward in our long-standing alliance with the United States by agreeing with President Obama that we would have US Marines train in our Northern Territory, which we do now. And it's a good place to train. You know, if you want a hard environment to go training in, you'd be hard-pressed to find a harder one than the Northern Territory, and they want those Marines to train in difficult places. So, look, we achieved that, a step forward in our alliance with the US, whilst at the same time agreeing with China, being one of the few countries in the world that has an agreement with China to annual leaders' meetings supported by annual exchanges between economic ministers and foreign ministers. So that was a huge leap forward for us. And you've got to remember that came off the back of some quite turbulent issues between us and China. You know, the economic relationship was going from strength to strength, but at the period that, you know, China's commodity demand was really growing, prices escalated a great deal, law of supply and demand. But there was some anxiety in China that Australian companies, BHP, Rio, had pressed the price button very, very hard, and that was somewhat resented. We had issues about the participation of Huawei in our national broadband network. We had an issue about a Uyghur leader coming to Australia, and we did not take active steps to refuse her a visa. There were some consular matters involving in particular Stern Hu, but a number of other Australians, some key consular matters. So there was turbulence in the relationship. We took a different view of the climate change negotiations in Copenhagen. So these things had created some static. So there was work for me to do, but I always wanted that work to happen on the basis that we could show strengthening both. And the reason I think that is possible, and the reason I think the zero-sum gamers are wrong, is that they are underestimating the depth and sophistication of the relationship between the US and China, who aren't putting people in the position of making this a zero-sum game. Now, with all of that, I am not naive about the tensions, and the tensions have got stronger, post my period of Prime Ministership. Some of the things that we've seen in the South China Sea have obviously caused people to have a great deal of concern and to reflect on how we are going to manage these tensions even more urgently than was happening before the issues between China and Vietnam, for example, and the issues between China and the Philippines getting quite as acute as they are now. So there are tensions to manage, but overall I am optimistic about it and optimistic about the potentials for both relationships from Australia's point of view to be positive, strong and growing.
And I think in that Australia has a lot in common with many other countries in this region who also are looking towards strong relations with China as well as the United States. But it seems to me that there are some circumstances in which that might be quite difficult to sustain. What if there's a really major security crisis in the Asia Pacific that involves China and the United States? Say, for example, if Beijing stepped up its assertiveness in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea, or with regard to Taiwan, in a way that provoked military or naval countermeasures by the United States, how do you think Australia should handle that? In other words, what if Australia's alliance commitments came to contradict its aim of maintaining positive relations, particularly in the economic sphere, with China?
Look, I don't think we will get there to a military confrontation question. I genuinely don't. I think everybody's got too many reasons to not get there. Now, how do you then resolve the strategic tensions in the South China Sea, the 9-dash line versus the competing territorial claims? I mean, from Australia's point of view, we don't take a position on the contending territorial claims, but what we do say is that the whole matter needs to be resolved peacefully. And we will continue to press that through all avenues of diplomacy, including direct with China. So, there are tensions to be managed. In terms of the hottest, rhetoric, confrontation I actually saw when I was Prime Minister. Yes, there was some tension in discussions about the South China Sea, but I'd actually have to say the hottest dispute I ever saw was between the Japanese Prime Minister and the representative of China at the Asia-Europe meeting over their territorial issues over the islands that each claim is theirs. And so, when we're looking at tensions in our region, I think it is, it's more complex than all eyes on China and just thinking about China and the South China Sea. There's a set of tensions to manage between China and Japan. There's a set of tensions to manage between Japan and Korea. For those of us who are allies of the United States, that is obviously, the Japan-Korea tension is a tension between two other allies of the United States. I mean, all of this means our region has its complexities, but overall it has a large number of strengths. The depth of the economic engagement that APEC has driven. And, you know, coming from my side of politics, we would claim that APEC is a great Labor Party legacy, that Bob Hawke and Paul Keating invested heavily in its creation and making sure that it was something at leaders level, and it's worked. Kevin Rudd is to be commended for the work he put into the East Asia Summit, and particularly the advocacy he engaged in to ensure that the US joined into the East Asia Summit. So there are some important dealing tables and architecture that is being built within the region that I think can help manage tensions.
I'd like to ask you about Singapore and Australia. In some respects, Singapore and Australia could not be more different. Australia is in one way much more than a country. It's a continent. You could say that Singapore is in a way less than a country. It's a city-state. Singapore is very densely populated. It's in the midst of Asia, geographically and also culturally. Australia has relatively, compared with its size, quite a small population. It's on the periphery of Asia, geographically and also culturally. Australia has a rumbustious, disrespectful Western democracy. Singapore's politics are much more restrained. Yet there are also some important commonalities between Singapore and Australia. Australia and Singapore are both modern. They're both highly urbanized countries. They're both advanced countries. They both rely on immigration as their lifeblood, with the benefits and problems that brings. They're both English-speaking. They both emphasize the importance of the rule of law in international relations. They also share security concerns. In some ways, you could say that Australia and Singapore are natural allies. How do you see the relationship between Australia and Singapore developing in the future?
My predecessor, Paul Keating, was fond of saying, when God was giving out the continents, not many people got a whole one to themselves, but we did. So you're right, very geographically different places, culturally very different as well. If I can give you one example of that just from my travels today. I flew from Australia today. I flew with my sister Alison, who is here. We turned up at Adelaide Airport. We were looking around for where we should go and check our bags in, and there's an Australian man who helps with information who says, "Julia, you're looking for counter 5. Then, of course, when I get to the Singapore Airlines lounge, the nice lady in the lounge refers to me immediately as Your Excellency. The cultural difference summarised in a few short steps in Adelaide Airport. You know, we're different places, but I actually think on strategic outlook, and this is what counts, strategic outlook and essential values, very similar places. And from, you know, my personal experience of sitting down with leaders, there is a limited number of leaders where you sit down and exchange worldviews and talk about problems, and effectively you're going, you know, yes, 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 we're in agreement about all of these things. And I certainly had that experience with the Prime Minister here and had it consistently. So I think the, you know, ties at every level, how we look at our region, the things that we value, the people-to-people links, the familiarity, the, you know, transport routes, the fact so many Australians are here working, so many Australians travel here regularly, all of that means that, you know, the relationship is a very strong one. And I know that there have been some discussions today between ministers in the new government, Mr Abbott's government, and the government here in Singapore, and there's a great deal of expectation about deepening the relationship for the future, and I think that's all to the good.
That's good to hear. I'd like to give our audience the chance to ask you some questions, but first I'd like to ask just one more question myself. You were Australia's first female Prime Minister. Given that Australian women have been politically engaged as voters and as legislators since the very beginning of the 20th century, and have been prominent in many other areas of public life, why do you think it took so long for Australia to have a woman as Prime Minister? And what were the challenges that you faced as Australia's first female PM?
Oh, well, I'm conscious we need to get to some audience questions, and to a question like that I could really say, how long have you got? I could be talking about it for a long time. On why did it take so long, really I think that's a question not about an individual coming forward, it's a question about how many women there are in politics. Because, you know, politics is an unpredictable beast, and to end up with women routinely being Prime Minister or being a Premier of one of our states, you need a critical mass of women. If there's only one woman or very few women, then the vicissitudes of politics probably mean she will end up facing circumstances that, you know, she doesn't get to the leadership. You know, in most political parties at any one time, if the leader left, people could think of 3 or 4 people who could step up, and maybe there would be a contest between them, but they can think of 3 or 4. Well, you're never going to get a woman routinely being Prime Minister unless, when you think of the next 3 or 4 in each political party, you know, two of them are women. And we haven't had that circumstance. So I came through. What we need is both sides of politics to be making sure that there are representative numbers of women at senior levels, so that when the leadership is available and people are making a decision about who should be the leader, there are credentialed senior women there. That's why I think it is to be deeply regretted that in our current cabinet there is only one woman. That is a very significant step back for our country, and I think is something that the Conservative side of politics in Australia needs to think about. In terms of the challenges, look, in some ways when you go through them, they almost sound trivial, but I think they add up to a set of difficulties. One, there's kind of no right answer on the family question. If you don't have children, then you are assumed to not understand what family life is about. If you do have children, then heavens, who's taking care of them? What on earth are you doing in politics, spending all of your time? Whereas a man, no one ever says, if a man is in politics and he's got 2 or 3 children, no one ever says, how can you be in politics and have children your age? You know, I've never heard that. Men who have got 2-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds, no one's ever said to them, well, you shouldn't be in politics. I mean, you've got young children to look after. So there's no right answer on the family question, and there's no equivalent for that in the life of male politicians. There's pretty much no right answer on the appearance question, because that gets so analysed and micro-analysed in an absurd way. And I think just in a very limited way. So for a male politician, there's basically the uniform of the suit and the tie, and, you know, it's pretty easy to get it right. There isn't, and you know, I mean, there's really 3 looks for male politicians. They've got the suit and tie on, or in Australia, they've got the male politician goes bush look on, which is the chinos, the navy blue blazer and the open neck shirt and the Akubra hat, or they've swanked up and they've got black tie on for a black tie event. And, you know, no one ever says, geez, given that tuxedo a flogging, do they? Whereas if I'd worn the same dress to a number of black tie events, you know, that way madness would have lain. So there's no right answer on the appearance question. And then I think that there are some, you know, deep-seated cultural issues about women in leadership, and the book Leaning In, which has taken the world by a lot of storm, points to some of this. It points to particularly a Harvard study where people are asked to read a case study about a business person, and then they're asked, would you like to work with that business person? Half of the group reads the case study and it's about a man, half of the group reads the case study and it's about a woman, and more of the group said that they would like to work with the man and that he seemed, you know, a good person and interesting. More of the group that read about the woman said that they wouldn't want to work with her. So there's a cultural correlation that in the back of our brains about success and likeability, which seems to work for men and not work for women. And it's a gender stereotype that is almost so deeply seated we're not conscious of it, but we need to think about it and think how we eradicate the biases it gives us about women in leadership.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to give our audience a chance to ask some questions now. Could I ask that if you'd like to pose a question, you raise your hand. Once I've recognised you, just stay where you are. The microphone will come to you. Then once you've got the microphone, please say who you are, what you do, or who you're affiliated with, and then ask your question as briefly and as pointedly as possible. And please restrict yourself to one question. Who'd like to be first? Sir, in the middle there.
Thank you, Mrs. Former Prime Minister. How was that decision being considered at the time, and how did you engage regional countries about the potential responses from them about the deployment, and also about Australia's role in the US repellents at large? Thank you.
Sure.
How was that decision being considered at the time, and how did you engage regional countries about the potential responses from them about the deployment, and also about Australia's role in the US repellents at large? Thank you.
Sure. The idea about Marines training in Darwin was the subject of discussion between Australia and the US over a period of time. I travelled relatively early in my Prime Ministership to Washington and discussed it with President Obama at that point, and then it was worked on over a number of months before President Obama came to Australia and spoke to our Parliament. We were conscious during all of that that it was well and truly possible that there would be an adverse regional reaction. And so before the announcement was made, we made sure that across the region, countries were briefed about what the announcement would be and our motivations in doing it. Now, it's no secret in the region that we are a long-standing ally of the United States, so people didn't need that explained to them. But the next step in terms of Marines training in Darwin, the benefits to the US, the benefits to us because it enables our Defence Force to train and to keep contemporary with what the US is doing, but the potential benefits to the region. Many times that we deploy military assets, I mean, I did this myself as Prime Minister, many times you deploy military assets, they're actually for humanitarian and disaster relief purposes. And living in this region of the world where we do tragically see so many disasters and we do need to come to each other's aid and assistance, to have the United States training here, to have the ability to do exercises, trilateral exercises, regional exercises about disaster preparedness is an important thing. And so we talked all of that through. And at the end of the day, whilst there were some points of criticism around the region, I think the reaction was overall quite accepting. President Yudhoyono in Indonesia, I think, possibly helped lead the tone of the regional reaction, and he could immediately see some of the benefits for things like natural disaster preparedness.
Thank you. Mr. Surya.
I'm Mr. Surya from the Institute of South Asian Studies here in Singapore. Ma'am, as Prime Minister of Australia, you had improved Australia's relations with India in particular in a rather big way by offering to sell uranium to India and sorting out the issue of the Indian students in Australia and so on and so forth. I can go on. Now that India has a new Prime Minister who is expected to be reasonably assertive in foreign policy terms, what kind of Australian foreign policy towards India would you advocate? Thank you.
During Prime Minister Rudd's period, we upgraded our relationship with India to that of a strategic partnership. I, at the time, as Deputy Prime Minister, needed to resolve a set of issues about the welfare of Indian students, which had put a great deal of stress on the relationship, and we did satisfactorily resolve those. And then, as you say, there was the in some ways, it wasn't a practical issue. It wasn't that India needed Australia's uranium, but it was an issue of relationship that the Labor government, of which I was a part, had the long-standing policy position that we wouldn't sell uranium to countries that weren't signatory to the nuclear non-proliferation arrangements, and India was not. So I needed to resolve that within our political party. So, I mean, all of that meant that the relationship was on the improve, and I do note Prime Minister Abbott has recently concluded that safeguards agreement now about uranium sales, which is a good thing. In terms of the new Prime Minister in India, I hope that, you know, our general settings for the relationship continue, and so the positive direction continues. I see no reason why that wouldn't be the case. I am personally a little bit troubled by the attitude that the new Prime Minister took to the Bali Trade Facilitation Agreement. I think that's to be regretted, because one of the important things that he brings and the prospect he brings into the leadership of India is deep-seated economic reform, and for the young people of India and for their hopes and potentials for the future, that is so vitally needed. But, you know, it's early days and one doesn't want to rush to judgment on any of these questions. So I see a very strong, positive, continuing relationship between our two countries.
Okay. Lady in red there.
Hi, I'm Ray. I'm a student at University of Toronto. As you have mentioned in the conversation that Singapore and Australia share a lot of commonality, for example, reliance on immigration. So in terms of Singapore, it has been restricting on the immigration matter, as a lot of local citizens complain about the opportunity being taken by immigrants or foreigners. So how is Australia balancing the benefit and problem comes with immigration?
That's a very good question, and these things in some ways are never easy. I mean, I'm an immigrant to Australia myself. We wouldn't have been there if during the days that my family migrated to Australia, the country's then kind of dominant ethos was populate or perish, and so they were looking for migrants from around the world, and particularly because of the long-standing relationship from the United Kingdom, and hence that's the Gillard family story. Under my government, we maintained a very sizable immigration program, and I think that is important to the country's future. But it needs to be done in a setting where you are managing any tensions about immigration. And in Australia, we've built a wonderful, peaceful, multicultural country. But when there are economic pressures on people's shoulders, when there's the sense that there's not enough opportunity for people, not enough jobs, not enough real opportunity, when there's the sense that there's a lot of stress on local services, local schools, local hospitals aren't appropriately funded, when infrastructure runs behind population growth and every time you turn around the traffic seems to have got worse, these things do build resentments, and if they aren't properly addressed and managed, then those resentments can get very difficult for immigration settings. So if I had one message, in some ways managing immigration isn't about immigration policy. Managing immigration is about economic policy and social policy, so people feel like the future has the prospect of being better than the past, that they have a place in it, and that there is no reason, therefore, for them to begrudge new people coming and joining their nation and being part of that common effort. Now, we haven't always got that balance right, but I think we've overwhelmingly got it right. And I would say that on a bipartisan basis, I think both sides of politics have overwhelmingly got that right. A continuing tension for us is Australians become very anxious when there are unauthorised arrivals by boat into Australia. That does tend to inflame community sentiment. It also can spur a lot of tragedy because a lot of people drown trying to reach Australia by boat across dangerous waters in vessels that aren't up to the task. And so we've had to be very tough-minded on those issues, trying to dissuade people from making those dangerous journeys. But that, if it becomes very partisan, and unfortunately while I was Prime Minister it did become very partisan, can also feed through and undermine people's attitudes to immigration and to newcomers.
Sir.
Good evening. My name is Charles Fang from Channel News Asia. I had the honour of being taught by Labour politicians like Carmen Lawrence and Kim Beazley, and it's an honour to be in the same room with you tonight.
Thank you.
My question is that it took President Yudhoyono to deal with 3 different Australian Prime Ministers to really discuss the issue about asylum seekers, and now that we're seeing 2 new Australian leaders, Tony Abbott and Jokowi from Indonesia. Do you think the asylum seeker issue can be addressed under the leadership of these 2 new leaders?
President Yudhoyono did take some steps to work with Australia on asylum seekers, and we were very grateful for that cooperation. But I actually think one of the great dangers for Australia's political discourse is that when people think of Australia-Indonesia, their mind runs to asylum seekers, and then the second issue that would often come to the minds of Australians would be Australians in trouble in Indonesia, because there have been some and continue to be some celebrated cases of Australians in Indonesian jails, Schapelle Corby and a number of others. The fact that Australians' minds run to these 2 things first, I think, is a difficulty. And one of the things I wanted to do was try and broaden the landscape. I mean, when we look at Indonesia, the nation which is home to the largest Muslim population on earth, right on our doorstep, you know, we are very close neighbours. I went to the first free, fair elections in Indonesia as an election monitor. So to see that democracy go from that start to where it is today, we had the stresses and differences of opinion about East Timor. And that was, you know, under Prime Minister Howard, there were some very difficult days. I, as Prime Minister, attended the first trilateral discussion. President of Indonesia, Prime Minister of Australia and the Prime Minister of East Timor. And if you'd said during those very difficult days that 10 years later the leaders of those 3 nations would be sitting down for a trilateral dialogue, people would have checked you for signs of fever. It would have just been viewed as ridiculous. So, you know, what has been achieved within Indonesia, what has been achieved broadly in our relationship, Indonesia-Australia, in my mind is, you know, it's a miracle. I mean, really a miracle. And we should never forget that. From our point of view, asylum seekers are a big issue. I can understand from President Yudhoyono's point of view, from his successor's point of view, that running a nation as vast and complex as Indonesia, this looms as a lesser problem in their minds than it looms in our minds. We've got to be respectful of that, but we've got to, whilst being respectful of that, keep working for further and further cooperation. I just hope that we don't continue to have our domestic frame on Indonesia just devolve down to this, because there's so much more that we can and should be doing.
Thank you. There was someone over here, I think. Mr. Joseph. Yeah.
Yes, good evening. My name is Joseph from Alpha and Omega Consultants. I have a question to you, madam. It's regarding the title, the white paper, the Asian Century. We had the Atlantic Century from 1875 to 1975, and they named the subsequent century, 1975 to 2075, as the Pacific Century. Now that you named the paper Asian Century, now I have a couple of questions. In fact, I'm curious to know. I have never read the paper, but I'd like to know the central argument of a paper, white paper, which is named Asian Century, and how it is distinct or different from the Pacific Century. As Dr. Huxley pointed out, you are more than a country, you are a continent. Being Prime Minister of Australia, I would naturally think you put the Australian century, if you want to put it that way. Because you are not part of Asia. You are a different country, different continent. So how can you relate the Pacific century to Asian century? Is it because you are part of Asia or because you are not part of Asia?
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. When I gave the speech that announced that we were going to put together a white paper called Australia in the Asian Century, there was a Chinese friend of mine who was at that speech who said to me on the way out, "This is fantastic. I came to lunch and I came back out with my own century. This is wonderful." The title of the paper was to emphasise in the thinking of Australians that none of us can see the future. That is obviously, an unpredictable thing. But if we were going to make some smart bets about what would define the economics, geopolitics, strategic calculus, cultural influences of this century, if we're going to make some smart bets about that, then the smart money would be that Asia in this century will exert more of an influence than it did in the last century, much, much more. Now, everybody then thinks that's about China. Well, yes, of course that's about China, but it's about more than China, because the countries of our region beyond China are seeing spectacular growth. We've just been talking about Indonesia, for example. Indonesia will be, a very important nation to the future of the world in this century. Now, I deliberately wanted to focus people's eyes on that in Australia, because as we went through in the introduction, if you wanted to give the short history of Australia, you would say after the arrival of, Captain Cook, obviously we had Indigenous Australia, then we had the arrival of white people, and then we had the period of looking to Britain, then we had the period of looking to the United States. Now we are in a period where, whilst we still have all of our ties to the United Kingdom, while we still have our alliance with the United States, we look to our region for our future. And so if you wanted to summarise that, when I was growing up, Australia's geographic position was seen as a disadvantage. We were remote from where we thought the world was happening. We were remote from the United Kingdom and from Europe. We were remote from the US, where the future was obviously being made in Hollywood. Where we are, our conception of ourselves now, where we are in the world, All of those things that I was taught when I was growing up, they are kind of wrong now, because our geographic position gives us the advantage of adjacency to the growth centres of this century. And that's what I wanted to focus people's minds on.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. So it's just in the middle here.
Thank you. I'm Daniel Bodirski from the Rajaratnam School. The Islamic State has attracted thousands of foreign fighters, including several hundred Australians. How should Australia cope with these individuals returning to the country in the future, and how should Australia continue with de-radicalization programs going into the future?
Okay.
They're both very good questions, and I mean, you know, in terms of issues in our world that would break your heart, obviously what's happening in Iraq is heartbreaking. What we've seen, Gaza, Israel, heartbreaking, the continuing circumstances in Syria, Ebola in Africa, the abduction of the Nigerian schoolgirls. There are many things in our world that are very difficult, and for global leaders at the moment, it must feel sometimes like their in trays are full of briefs about misery and suffering. Certainly our nation has been very focused on all of these events, as well as the circumstances in the Ukraine and the downing of the Malaysian Airlines plane and the loss of Australian life on that and the lives of others. So there's a lot of tough things going on with many ramifications. And one of the ramifications for domestic governments like ours is that we need a set of policies that will deal with radicalised, potentially hardened fighters who return to Australia because they are Australians, because they are citizens, because they were born there, but they've been drawn to this struggle. Now, we've faced some of that before, but not in these numbers, and it requires, some hard thinking about security settings, and some of that hard thinking is going on at the moment. In all of this, in all of what ends up under the banner of counter-terrorism work, there is fine political judgments to be made about maximising security whilst not undermining historic freedoms, our sense of self and who we are. And for the world, I think that there are some lessons, some hard lessons that we seem to have to learn over and over. It is one thing to go and fight. It is, as we have fought, I mean, we fought in Iraq, we fought in Afghanistan, we still got people in Afghanistan. It is one thing for the world to fight. It is another thing to grow robust, liberal democracy out of the ashes. And we, time after time, seem to underestimate how difficult it is to do that, and how quickly what we thought was a situation that was improving is going backwards and backwards at a rate of knots. So, whilst, yes, there will have to be domestic debates about security policy because of the return of individuals, I think the broader set of thinking that the world has to do is on this question of how we, as a global community, better support nations emerging from conflict to grow institutions that will take deep roots. You look at our own region of the world, the problems we faced in PNG, the problems we faced in Fiji, you just don't pick up liberal democracy and put it down somewhere and say, job done. And yet, time after time, I think we kind of naively think that this can happen, will happen, that the benefits of democracy and the rule of law and I can't even say it, pluralism, that these things are so self-evident that somehow that they will mature themselves. They just don't. So some hard thinking to do right around the world, and some very tough circumstances facing global leaders right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for answering that quite a wide range of questions. There's one question I'd like to ask you myself, if I may, just to close this session, because unfortunately we are running out of time. You held the highest elected position in Australia. Just over a year ago, you left politics, but you still have many years of working life ahead of you. Could you tell us something about what you've been doing over the last year and how you see the future, what your objectives are now?
Sure. Well, I've written a book. It's what former Prime Ministers do. So I have written a book, and it is thankfully, printed and going to be launched at the end of September. But that's taken a great deal of time and thought and reflection, and some bits came easier than others. And I've never written a book before, so it's been all a voyage of discovery for me. But apart from writing the book, what I wanted to do was to continue really the things that took me into politics and first enlivened my political interest, and that I pursued through as Deputy Prime Minister and as Prime Minister, and that really is the politics of opportunity, creating opportunity through education. So I've taken two new roles. One is chairing the Global Partnership for Education, which is the big multilateral funder of education in developing countries, working in 59 developing countries around the world. We are trying to acquit the world's promise through the Millennium Development Goals that every child will get access to primary school. We're, as a global community, 58 million children behind where we should be. And then, of course, we would want to lift ambition beyond the Millennium Development Goals so that children can get to go to secondary school as well. So I'm doing that, and that's delightful work, challenging work, but delightful work. I'm also a non-resident Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Brookings think tank in Washington in the Centre for Universal Education there. And so that's trying to grapple with some of the big policy questions. So GPE doing the funding and Brookings trying to grapple with some of the big policy questions. And the things we're specifically working on there, or that I'm specifically doing, how we better measure learning outcomes so that at the end of the day we're not just as a global community saying let's get kids to go and sit in somewhere called a school. Okay, that's a good thing, but we actually want them to learn in that school. How do we measure the learning and improve the learning? How do we scale up things that are working? In most countries in the world, you can go to a school that is really doing remarkable things, or see a girls' education program that's really working, but when you try and scale it up for the whole of that country, it doesn't work. You know, what are the factors that enable scalability? And then some work on girls' education, because I was disturbed to find that there were some in the global education community who were wandering around saying to each other that in education we were in a post-gender world because we'd seen some increases in girls' enrolment rates. We're not in a post-gender world. For any part of the world, when you do the statistics about, who's missing out, normally you find that the girls are behind the boys, and as we lift ambition into lower secondary and universal access, we are going to confront a whole series of issues about girls and how they're viewed and how their education is viewed, and things like child marriage, which is another form of sexual slavery, child marriage, young girls being used as domestic labour, farm labour, being denied opportunities, cultural stereotypes. We're going to have to work our way through that. So we're trying to do some of that thinking now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for answering all our questions so frankly and fully and carefully. I think we'll all look forward to reading your book before long. I'm very sorry that we need to bring this session to a close soon. Our hour has gone gone very quickly, but before doing that, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for making time during your visit to Singapore to come and speak at this event in the Fullerton Lecture Series. You didn't give a lecture as such, but I think you told us far more during the course of this hour than might have been possible in a lecture, and that's terrific and of great benefit to us. You've shared really important insights on a range of issues, particularly issues with foreign policy implications, because that was what many of us chose to focus on in our questions. And I think it was particularly valuable that you helped us to understand the Australia in the Asian Century white paper, which is clearly a very important reference point in Australia's relations with this region. And I think it was also very valuable to have your reflections on what you're doing now and on your role as Australia's first female Prime Minister. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.